welcome everyone to a bit of an overview of InferESG. There's been quite a lot of demand for a demo of what InferESG is, so we thought we'd jump on a call, David and I, and just record it and talk about it and walk you through it. So I guess a bit of context before we jump into the demo. This was built in response to a innovation call by FinTech Scotland. They were looking for uses of emerging technology to spot greenwashing. And so we responded with a solution that uses something we'd already partially built, so an Agentic AI framework called Infer. And we built it out with some new agents, some new components to specifically work in the ESG space. And we'll talk you through some of those in a moment. I should say that this is quite rough and ready. I mean, the UI is pretty good, but it's not, it's not fully production grade, and neither is the system, because this is really designed to be like a solution accelerator or it's more than a proof of concept. It's more evolved than that. But the point of this was it's a research project to look at the AI, more the back end side of things, how these things can integrate with data sources and in web searches, rather than be a fully sort of productionized system. So when you load InferESG, it gives you a bit of an introduction and talks about how, to start with, you use it by uploading a sustainability report. And it reminds everyone that it's not here to determine what is and isn't greenwashing. It flags things and helps a human being, kind of an analyst, come to conclusions for themselves on what's being called out. I guess we've kicked this one off, haven't we, David, with uploading a company sustainability report?
Yeah, so this one's primarily focused on an environmental sustainability report rather than a full ESG report. You can see that evidence in the start of the overview where it explains the different aspects of this report. So here, after the general overview about which company we're looking at and the sector that it's in, it then goes into how it looks at the ESG aspects and how much of that report covers those factors. So in this case, it's only covering 80% of the report is about the environment, which makes sense. It's an environmental report.
Yeah. So if you want to walk through this a little bit, David, so it's kind of called out the percentages, doesn't it, of the content of the report, but then it kind of breaks things down, doesn't it, into environmental, social, and then governance. And I think it's fair to say in our work so far, we've focused probably most on environment and social, a little bit on governance, but I have to say the greenwashing is obviously more commonly associated with environmental or green issues. So whilst those are present, I think probably more of our robust testing has been done on E and S, environmental and social. If you want to scroll down, so we've got sort of some environmental commitments called out here around emissions and climate commitments, resource management, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. You've got things like the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, science-based targets. So it's calling out the kind of key points really from the reports. We've got analysis of goals and achievements, and then after we've kind of called out
just pointing out as well that often if there is information lacking, then it will call out the information is lacking. So in this case here, the independent verification status is quite clearly identifying that the document doesn't specify any independent verification. So it's not just looking for what's in the report, it's also looking for what's not in the report, which is just as valuable.
Yeah, that's a really fair point, and something we'll come back to when we talk about the materiality piece. So I guess the next bit this is talking about then is after we've called out the claims, we then start talking about the potential greenwashing. So, and then we kind of put these under different headings here, as you can see. So there's one here around stated environmental metrics versus industry standards, another one around missing baseline data and calculation methodologies, another one around non-standard or proprietary measurement methods. Now, these things might not be greenwashing, but these are just potential areas that the system's called out to say, hey, you might want to go and do a bit of digging here and assess whether these things are greenwashing or not. If you want to keep going down, again, more analysis, documentation gaps, and so on and so forth. We then start to call out things like what are the environmental regulation standards and certifications that are present and sort of mentioned. So working with our industry partner that sponsored this research, one of the bits of feedback they gave us is they wanted more specific. So they didn't just want general sort of blurb. They wanted sort of specific numbers or specific references to standards bodies or targets or progress. So that's why we've tried to keep it fairly concise. I mean, it's obviously quite a long analysis. You might choose to just see bits of this or use different parts of it in a workflow where you're assessing for greenwashing, or the environmental status of a company. So yeah, if you want to keep going down, David, let's keep going through. So yeah, the next area we get to is social. We do something very similar with the social sort of things that are the goals and progress that's claimed. We outline that. We've got workforce ones here, then community, then supply chain responsibility, social value, and then general observations about that. And then the next section then is to call out potential social washing based on what the report does or doesn't contain. If we want to keep going, and I think we'll skip over governance, because governance is again very similar to environment and social, and this report is actually, as you said, David, more about environment anyway, so it's not really going to be that relevant. But if you keep going down until we get to materiality. So materiality. So this is, so David, perhaps give everyone an idea of what the sort of curated library is here that this is based on.
So behind the scenes, there's effectively a curated library of documents. These documents could be, they currently are TNFD documents, and also GRI, but it could be SASB documents if you have access to those. It could be any documents you like, but that library is basically your curated library of materiality documents. And so when we get to this part of the report, we have the materiality agent kick in. So it first determines what is the company we're talking about, what is their industry sector, and therefore what are the material topics that are relevant to them. And when it goes through that documentation library and compares it to the report we have here, and that's how it's coming up with this idea of what is relevant and how much of that is covered by the document.
Yeah. So yeah, we've got examples here of the sort of industry coverage, industry relevance, high, medium, low, and then the coverage level and sort of key findings where there's those gaps that you were talking about. So yeah, we've got some things here around environmental footprint of hardware infrastructure. So it's kind of showing that there is, the things you would expect from a materiality point of view are in here. So if you keep going down, we then sort of do some gap analysis and overall assessment, and then come up with a conclusion. So, what's interesting here with the conclusion, if you keep going, the idea here is in the future this system could go even further on an automated basis. So these sort of claims that we're calling out that perhaps a human analyst should check, we could further automate this, by almost having an option to go click and investigate these, or perhaps do that as standard, because there's a bit more deep diving, a bit more drilling into the detail. It might be doing a web search or other things to verify that. But at the moment, those are left as sort of actions for the analyst and recommendations for the analyst's next steps. And I guess what we'll then now illustrate, David, is where we flip from what we've described so far. I guess is more like an AI workflow. It's something that's predetermined. There's a structure to it. It's repeated each time you upload a report. Next bit's a bit more agentic, isn't it? Because when someone asks questions about this report and greenwashing, it's then going to decide behind the scenes, isn't it, what agents to use, what approaches to use to answer that question.
Yeah, that gets a lot more dynamic at this point. When we often see with chatbots, you're presented with a prompt, and you kind of you need to start the conversation, because otherwise it doesn't do anything. With this system, it starts off with that report. So by giving it the context, it now has all this context, all this knowledge, and knows what you're talking about. And now you're kind of led to have the conversation. It's already kind of started the conversation with you, if you like. So you've got all this information on your left. And so you can sort of question, well, tell me more about this particular thing. So for example, we identified in the environmental goals and progress that this company is aiming to remove all historical emissions by 2050. Okay, so as an analyst, you might be curious, well, how do they plan to do that? And this is where the second part comes in. I can ask, how does it plan to do that? That's exactly what we've got in this example. So here I prompted it. How does the company plan to remove all historical carbon emissions by 2050? This goes away. It understands what the question is. It sort of determines the intent of your question, breaks it down to smaller pieces, and then chooses which agents to use. These could be looking at existing files that are in the system. It could be looking at a generalist agent, basically the standard LLM, or in this case, it's actually using a web agent. So it's going off and making web searches, collating all the sort of its findings, and then it puts up those findings together and answers the question and summarizes it here. So you can see we've got the key points, which tries to answer that question.
Yeah, and so I guess crucially, transparency was an important thing with this research project as well. We wanted to show how things were traceable. So this is a bit raw, but if we click on how I came to this conclusion, this is like effectively a dump of the variables that are sitting behind the system. So we've got, essentially the agents that we use, the questions that were asked, and the results. So you can see we're not, this isn't smoke and mirrors. This is genuinely going off and looking at the web, using the web agents to go and find answers. And then we're putting that together and summarizing it for the person. And as I said earlier, some of these things could potentially be further automated, but for now, this is the more interactive sort of back and forth with a human analyst or someone who's curious about sustainability would use this tool to help educate themselves on where should I start? What are the areas I should dive a bit more deeper on. What was the next question that you thought? Yeah, what's next? So yeah, okay. Do you want to talk about the next one?
Yeah, so we followed up with another question, slightly unrelated. So we asked about the actual reported emissions. So the current report we're looking at, the sustainability report, goes back to 2024. So I've asked it, okay, well, tell me about the past 3 years and how has this changed? And again, the intent agent determines, tries to break down the question, tries to understand what the meaning is, what the intent of the question is. And again, it determines which agents to go use. It's not always, it doesn't always go perfectly well knowing which agent it's going to use. It's very much on its own to do that. But in this case, again, it's just determined that the web agent is probably the right one. So it's gone off to the web and it's gone back and searched 3 years of emissions history. And again, it's collated it, created an answer. And as you can see, it's bullet pointed with plenty of actual metrics, numbers, data, dates, and it's all presented back to you in a quite a concise but detailed answer.
Yeah. And so I guess the other thing we've not spoken about is the suggested questions at the bottom. So as we're kind of having this dialogue, the system is looking at what's being asked and it's sort of thinking about what's the next sort of related question to what's kind of been talked about or covered already, right?
Yeah. So as the conversation sort of continues, even from after uploading the first report and getting that initial report back, the suggestions part of this is always trying to provide questions related to the context and the content that's been going on. So it's always maintaining this, what we call a scratch pad. So it's maintaining this historical conversation. So it knows what we're talking about, it knows who we're talking about, and then it can basically provide suggested questions that are relevant to this topic. And of course, this whole thing is framed around ESG, so it's always going to be within those boundaries. But it allows you to, again, it helps the user kind of be prompted into asking a question and kind of maybe making some suggestions to help them along. But also, it can help you sort of deep dive even further. It can kind of keep you focused on that topic and maybe ask more questions. So this is just a really bit of a helpful feature just to kind of nudge that conversation along if you're not quite sure what you want to ask. So yeah.
Awesome. And so I guess whilst we've applied this to ESG, there's nothing stopping this being applied to a whole range of different sort of analytic topics, right? If there's something that requires wading through lots of material, lots of written material, maybe structured and unstructured data, this is something that could be brought to bear on that, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the original sustainability report we uploaded is, I think, about 60, 70 pages of information. I think it's a 20 megabyte file. There's a lot of content, including graphs and sort of visual data. And of course, our curated library has, I think, a dozen or so other very large files that are somewhere in the hundreds of pages long. For an analyst to absorb all of that information and be able to make those comparisons is a huge cognitive ask. It's just almost impossible to manage. And it would take you hours, if not days, to really process this information. What this does is it just does it kind of for you. But rather than taking away the work from the analyst, it's helping to augment them. The analyst still has the control, the decision making, and what questions it wants to ask and which kind of avenue it wants to pursue. All this does is just puts the information together for you and presents it. And it's accurate, it's precise.
Yeah. Yeah, what sort of performance were we getting during the testing of the research phase?
So testing, we adopted some sort of LLM type testings, the F1 score system, which is about precision and recall of information. So our testing sort of procedure was loosely based on that. We would basically feed in the questions, get the answers, and then we would manually go through and sort of verify and fact check this, see what was missing. Used other AI systems to also do this for us to help catch things. But ultimately, we're getting well over 90% on both precision and recall. So we were quite confident that it was doing the right thing. It was identifying stuff that was there as well as the things that weren't there. So again, it was really important that it was actually identifying stuff that didn't exist rather than just things that did exist.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I was quite reassured is for some questions we've asked this, it does at times come back and say, sorry, I can't answer this. Now, I guess sometimes that's because perhaps something hasn't quite worked behind the scenes because this is a research project that's not all working beautifully. But in other cases, it's because it genuinely can't answer. So that's quite reassuring, because I guess one of the things we didn't want was the sort of classic overconfident answering when, there isn't the data available to sort of respond. So that's quite good. Well, look, David, thanks for jumping on with me and walking through this. And I guess anyone watching this who wants to know more, we're very happy, either of us, to jump on a call with you and take you through this in more depth. Yeah, do connect with us on LinkedIn or drop an email to sustainability@scottlogic.com. But yeah, equally, you can find us on LinkedIn and ping us a message on there. And with that, thanks, David.
Thank you.